The next topic is testing the Whorf hypothesis. Experimental tests of Whorf hypothesis basically fall into two groups. One is that basically looks at the lexical aspect of the hypothesis to examine it, and the second one is the grammatical level. Now, before looking at these studies, however, we have to consider what needs to be understood with regard to the linguistic relativity of the hypothesis. Now, for that matter, in order to test the Whorf hypothesis, there are three domains which actually fall into this category. One is differences in language. When we're talking about differences in language, we basically refer to the lexical and grammatical aspects. Then we have differences in thought. That is basically the habitual mode of thinking. So the differences in that. And the third is languages determine thought. So this is another domain and a very important domain with regard to the testing of the hypothesis, whereas that not only looking at what needs to be said, but how relatively easy it is to say something which are there in your mental processes. Two approaches have been tested with regard to this. The one is the strongest version, which is basically language and its ability to determine thought, and the weakest version, which is basically linguistic relativity. And there are other things that also come under test with regard to this hypothesis. They concern with the color terms, counting numbers, and other objects such as space, time, grammar, etc. So now let's see what type of studies that have been conducted in order to test this particular hypothesis. Now, the first point is related to the differences in language that determine differences in thinking must at the outset define three key terms. So, as I've mentioned, those key terms are differences in language, differences in thinking, and also language or languages determine thought. Now, the first one, which says differences in language, this has been done in two ways. One way is to compare language that linguistically marks a particular conceptual distinction with a language that does not. Thus, the presence or absence of the explicit linguistic marking is the language difference of interest. Although most studies have approached the problem in this way, another possibility is to compare two languages that mark the same distinction in different ways. This comparison focuses not on whether a language marks a concept, but rather how it does so. The second, which is difference in thinking, this is something we need to define in a very satisfactory manner. It is obviously difficult to measure a person's worldview, but it should be kept in mind that Whorf was especially interested in those aspects of thinking that indicated a habitual mode of thought. What do we mean by habitual mode of thought? Lucy defines habitual thought as routine ways of attending to objects and events, categorizing them, remembering them, and perhaps even reflecting upon them. The mode is contrasted with specialized thought, which is composed of cognitive routines or structures that are restricted either to certain subgroup within a culture or to certain domains, such as kinship or illness, etc. Psychologists and anthropologists have also studied a wide range of cognitive processes, including form perceptions, color perception, mathematical thinking, and logical reasoning with regard to this particular point. Then we have the third point, which basically says that languages determine thought. The linguistic determinism hypothesis can be interpreted in at least two different ways. One is the strong version, that language determines cognition. The presence of linguistic categories creates cognitive categories. Now, in this view, the presence of terms to refer to different objects that move through the air produces the cognitive ability to discriminate between birds and airplanes. Although some of Whorf's comments suggest that he believed in the strong version of linguistic determinism, less recent interpreters of his work have claimed that he did not. Alternatively, a weak version of the hypothesis states the presence of linguistic categories influence the ease with which various cognitive operations are formed. Certain thought processes may be more accessible or more easily performed by members of one linguistic community relative to those of a different linguistic community. So these are some of the points that have been used to test the Whorf hypothesis, especially with regard to the strongest version, that is, the language determines thought, and the weaker version, that is, different people speak differently and they also think differently. Hence, psychological studies of the Whorf hypothesis have examined whether lexical and grammatical differences between languages influence various non-linguistic cognitive processes.